Hey, I know we haven't talked in years, and this probably isn't the best way to reach out, but please listen. There's something I need to tell you. Working the night shift at a pawn shop wasn't exactly my dream job, but the pay's decent, and with bills piling up, I don't really have the luxury of quitting. The shop itself wasn't anything special, just a cluttered place full of forgotten items. Old radios, tarnished jewelry, dusty tools. Still, something about it always felt a little off after dark. It was probably just my imagination, or the fact that the shop was located in a sketchy part of town. I tried not to think too much about it. Tonight had been uneventful so far. The usual late-night stragglers had wandered in, mostly people trying to sell off old electronics, a few desperate folks pawning jewelry for some quick cash. By 2 a.m., the shop was empty, nothing out of the ordinary. I hadn't gotten much rest before the shift, so I figured watching some YouTube videos might help keep me distracted. I was struggling to keep my eyes open when, all of a sudden, a man walked in. The man looked nervous from the moment he stepped through the door. He was tall, with bags under his eyes like he hadn't slept in days. His clothes were rumpled, and his hands fidgeted as he clutched a small wooden box under one arm. I hadn't seen him before, and I'd been working here long enough to recognize most of the late-night customers. I glanced up from the counter. "Can I help you?" I asked. He stepped forward, not saying much, just placed the box down carefully. It was a nice piece, I'll admit, made of old wood, really detailed carvings, probably one of those things you'd see in an antique store. I half expected him to give me some long story about where it came from, or how valuable it was, like most people did when they wanted to pawn off something that looked remotely fancy. "I need to get rid of this," he said, his voice quiet, a little shaky. I raised an eyebrow, leaning back a bit. "Get rid of it? Not sell it?" He shook his head quickly. "I don't care what you give me for it, I just don't want it anymore." I couldn't help but chuckle under my breath. "That bad, huh? What, does it play annoying music or something?" He didn't laugh, just stood there, tense. "No, it's weird." I glanced at the box, not feeling anything off about it. Just wood, carved all fancy. Weird how? The man rubbed the back of his neck, clearly struggling to put his thoughts into words. "I don't know. Strange things have been happening. At first it was small stuff. I'd put it on a shelf, and the next morning it would be in a different spot. Thought I was just imagining it, you know? But then it got worse. I started hearing noises, scratching sounds, and at night I'd smell this awful metallic stench. I've cleaned my place top to bottom, but it's like the smell is coming from the box." His eyes met mine, wide and haunted. "I don't know what's in it, and I don't want to know. I just need it gone." People usually came in hoping to score a few extra bucks, especially with something that looked old and possibly valuable. But this guy just wanted it gone. "Okay," I said slowly, trying to hide my skepticism. "I'll take it off your hands." Before I could reach for the box, his hand shot out and grabbed my wrist, his grip surprisingly cold. "Don't open it," he said sharply. "Whatever you do, don't open it." I raised my eyebrows, more amused than alarmed. "Sure, no problem." He let go of my wrist and stepped back, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Good. I don't care how much you give me for it. Just keep it." He took the money I gave him, and without another word, he turned and hurried out the door, the bell jingling softly as he disappeared into the night. I shook my head and looked down at the box, still sitting on the counter. He'd seemed pretty worked up over it, but to me, it just looked like an old trinket box, Nothing special. I picked it up carefully, turning it over in my hands. The carvings were detailed, swirling patterns running along the surface. It had some weight to it, more than I expected for something so small. But other than that, it was just a box. No scratching, no creepy smells, just wood. I tucked it into a drawer under the counter, out of sight, and got back to work. There wasn't much to do this late, just the usual inventory check and making sure the display cases were clean. But even as I tried to focus on the mundane tasks, my mind kept drifting back to that guy and the way he'd looked at the box. Still, I shrugged it off. People bring all kinds of weird stories in here, hoping their stuff's got some mystery value. This was probably just another one of those. I wiped down the counter, thinking about how nice it would be to close up and head home. The hours ticked by, and the shop was as quiet as ever. That's when I noticed it. A faint, almost metallic smell hanging in the air. I wrinkled my nose, trying to place where it was coming from. Maybe something in the back had gone bad. I checked the shelves, the back room, and even the trash, but everything seemed normal. Weird. When my shift finally ended, I was more than ready to leave. Locking up, I stepped out into the cool night air and tried to shake off the unease that had been creeping in all night. The walk home was quiet, the city mostly asleep, and by the time I got back to my apartment, I'd nearly forgotten about the box. My apartment was small and cluttered, but it was mine. The moment I stepped through the door, I felt the tension in my shoulders ease. Home was safe, normal. I put the strange events of the night behind me and fell into bed, exhausted. As I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't help but wonder what was inside that box and why the man had been so terrified of it. Back at the shop the next night, I wasn't expecting anything unusual. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, but the minute I did, something felt different. As I walked the aisles, it seemed like some of the items had moved. Little things, like the keys hanging on the wall, were now slightly askew, and the doll I hated, the one in the far corner, was now facing me, even though I was sure I'd turned it away yesterday. I stared at it for a second, convinced I must have just misremembered. Still, a shiver crawled down my spine. I told myself it was nothing. But then, while I was restocking the glass case, I heard something. A faint sound, like scratching, coming from the drawer under the counter. I froze, my hands hovering over the case. It was soft, barely audible, but it was there. Something was moving. Slowly, I stepped toward the counter, heart pounding in my chest. I pulled open the drawer and nothing. The box, sitting just as I'd left it. Nothing unusual. No sign of movement. I went back to my routine, forcing myself to focus on different things. And every now and then, I'd catch the faintest whisper of sound coming from the direction where the doll was. By the time I locked up and left, my nerves were shot. As I made my way home, I kept my head down, the cool night air biting at my skin. I felt on edge, unable to shake the creeping sensation that I was being followed, that something unseen was watching my every move. By the time I reached my apartment, I felt exhausted, both physically and mentally, but the unease from the shop still clung to me. I locked the door behind me and went straight to bed, hoping that sleep would drown out the creeping dread. But as I lay there in the dark, something felt wrong. My apartment was too quiet, too still. I turned over, closing my eyes, willing myself to sleep. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of the TV turning on in the living room. I sat up, my heart pounding. The room was still dark, but the faint flicker of light from the TV cast shadows across the hallway. I had hadn't turned it on. I hesitated for a moment, listening to the low static humming from the other room. Finally, I swung my legs over the side of the bed and crept toward the living room, every step feeling heavier than the last. As I rounded the corner, I saw the TV screen flickering, bathing the room in a pale, ghostly light. Static buzzed across the screen, but as I stood there, staring at it, I noticed something else. I heard a low groan, like furniture being dragged across the floor, coming from the bedroom. An icy chill ran through me, rooting me to the spot in sheer terror. I had been there just a moment ago. I rushed to the bedroom and switched the lights on. There wasn't anybody there, but what I noticed made my skin crawl. The wardrobe had been dragged, leaving deep scratches in the floor, and its doors were slightly ajar, as if someone or something had just stepped out. Then, without warning, the static on the TV shifted. The screen flickered and switched to a news channel, the volume creeping up on its own. A woman's voice echoed through the room, but what she was saying froze the blood in my veins.
White Caucasian male was found dead late last night after an apparent suicide. Police say the man, whose identity has not yet been released, jumped from the roof of a downtown building.
A photo of the man appeared on the screen. The man from the pawn shop. His gaunt, haunted eyes stared back at me. A face I hadn't been able to forget since he handed me that box. He was dead. The same man who'd practically begged me to take the box, who had warned me not to open it. The camera panned to the building where he'd died, the anchor's voice continuing, but I could barely hear her over the sound of my own heartbeat. The room seemed to close in around me, the air thick with dread. I sank onto the couch, trying to steady my breathing, but the whispers I had heard earlier were growing louder, circling me. I looked around the room, certain I was alone, but unable to shake the feeling that something else was there. The man's death, the box, the strange occurrences in the shop and my apartment. It was all connected. I couldn't stop thinking about the news. The man, dead. Thrown himself off a building, just like that. His face on the TV kept flashing in my mind. Those haunted eyes that had stared at me across the counter at the pawn shop. The box was still at the shop. I hadn't touched it since he left it there, but I could feel its pull. Something inside it wanted out, and the man had known that. I knew I couldn't stay in the house any longer, so I got dressed and left the apartment. I wandered into a nearby cafe to grab a coffee, desperate to shake off the exhaustion that had been creeping over me after everything that had happened. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I was startled awake by one of the baristas, who told me I'd been out for almost an hour, and they were worried something was wrong. Feeling a sudden, uneasy surge of energy, I tried to keep myself distracted for the remainder of the day, walking aimlessly through the park, hopping from one cafe to another. But the exhaustion weighed on me, and I found myself nodding off here and there, barely holding on to any sense of sanity, trying to brace myself for the next night shift. I couldn't stay like this. I knew something had to be done. That evening, I walked into the pawn shop with dread twisting in my stomach. Everything felt wrong from the moment I stepped inside. The lights flickered in a way they hadn't before. Longer, darker, like something was hiding just beyond their glow. The air felt suffocating, thick and heavy, like a weight pressing down on my chest. Every sound, from the creak of the old floorboards to the hum of the ancient fridge in the back, was amplified, making me jump at the smallest noise. I moved toward the back of the shop, where the shelves were lined with old toys, clocks, and other knickknacks. That's when I saw it. The doll. The same one that gave me the creeps since the first day I laid eyes on it. But now it wasn't sitting. It was standing. At first, I thought I was seeing things, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But it was real. The doll stood there, its vacant eyes now locked on mine, as if it was watching my every move. It didn't shift. It didn't move. But something about it was horribly, unnervingly wrong. I backed away slowly, my eyes never leaving the doll, my breath caught in my throat. It stayed there, unmoving, its eerie gaze fixed on me, as if daring me to make the first move. My heart pounded harder with each step as I edged toward the front of the shop, my body trembling. Finally, I reached the counter, my back hitting the hard surface. My hands fumbled for the drawer, yanking it open with a sharp pull. My fingers curled around the box inside. I didn't care about the man's warnings anymore. I didn't care what was inside. All I knew was that I needed to get rid of it. Without thinking, I stuffed the box into my bag and ran out of the shop into the night. The air outside was cold, biting at my skin as I rushed down the street. I didn't stop running until I reached the old river on the edge of town. The water was dark, reflecting nothing but the night sky. I stood at the bank, panting, my breath forming clouds in the air as I stared at the box in my hands. I threw the box as hard as I could, watching as it arced through the air and splashed into the river. For a moment, the water rippled, the box bobbing at the surface before it sank, disappearing into the depths. I stood there, my breath finally slowing. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. It was gone. I'd done it. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A shadow moved at the edge of the water, barely visible in the darkness. I froze, squinting into the night, but I couldn't see anything. Just shadows, just the trees swaying in the wind. I shook my head and walked back to the pawn shop, telling myself it was over. When I arrived back at the shop, I told myself I'd forget all about it. The box was gone. Everything was normal again. I had to believe that. But the moment I walked through the door, my stomach dropped. The drawer was open, and the box was inside, dripping wet. I stared at it, my heart pounding. How? I had thrown it in the river. I had seen it sink. There was no way it could be back. But there it was, sitting in the drawer like it had never left. The whispers returned, louder this time, swirling around me like a storm. I felt panic clawing at my throat. There was no escaping it. The box wanted something, and until I figured out how to stop it, it would never leave me alone. Desperation clung to me like a second skin as I left the shop, clutching the cursed box under my arm. The weight of it felt heavier than before, as though it had soaked up all the fear and dread I had been feeling since the man first left it with me. My mind raced, searching for any solution, any way to rid myself of the box once and for all. The river hadn't worked. It had returned to me, wet and dripping, as if mocking my attempt. I needed something else. I needed to destroy it completely. An old, abandoned warehouse nearby was the only place I could think of, forgotten and crumbling, with no one around to question why I was setting something on fire in the dead of night. When I arrived, the warehouse loomed before me like a hulking corpse. Its roof had collapsed long ago, leaving its skeleton exposed to the elements. The place smelled of decay and rot, but it was quiet, isolated. I found some old, broken wooden furniture and piled it in the center of the open space. The moonlight trickled in through gaps in the roof, casting long, eerie shadows across the cracked concrete floor. With trembling fingers, I placed the box on top of the makeshift pyre. It sat there, small and innocent looking, as though it hadn't caused all this chaos. But I knew better now. I fumbled with the matches, striking them over and over, until finally, a small flame sparked to life. I set the fire carefully, watching as the flames licked at the dry wood, the heat growing stronger with each passing second. The fire spread quickly, consuming the furniture, and I stepped back, holding my breath as the flames began to crawl toward the box. For a moment, the box sat untouched, as though the fire refused to touch it. The flames danced around it, flickering and twisting unnaturally, casting grotesque shapes across the warehouse walls. Then, slowly, the edges of the box began to darken and curl. But just as the fire caught, something changed. The flames shifted, turning an eerie shade of blue, then green. Colors no fire should ever burn. The air around me grew thick, almost oppressive, like the weight of the entire warehouse was pressing down on me. And then came the screams. They started softly, like distant wails carried on the wind, but quickly grew louder. Agonizing, high-pitched, inhuman screams that pierced through the crackle of the fire and burrowed into my skull. It was as though whatever had been locked inside that box was now being released, its rage and pain pouring out into the world around me. I clamped my hands over my ears, but the screams only grew louder, more unbearable. They weren't just coming from the fire. They were inside my head, scratching at the walls of my mind. I fell to my knees, gasping for air, my eyes squeezed shut as the noise drowned everything else out. Amidst the overwhelming noise, another sound reached my ears. Footsteps. I opened my eyes and saw it. The doll. It was here, standing at the edge of the firelight, bathed in the unnatural glow of the flames. Its porcelain face, once blank and expressionless, was now twisted into something grotesque, a demonic grin spreading across its delicate features. Its glass eyes, once dull, were alive with malice, reflecting the strange, shifting colors of the fire. The doll's small, delicate feet scraped against the floor as it took one slow, deliberate step toward me, and then another. Its limbs moved stiffly, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings, jerking with each step. But there was something else. It held a knife in its hand, a small, rusted blade that gleamed in the firelight. The doll's head tilted, as though it were studying me, savoring the moment. It took another step, faster this time, and then another, its feet tapping against the concrete in a rapid pace. I stumbled backward, my pulse racing, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The screams from the fire were deafening now, swirling around me in a symphony of madness. And yet all I could focus on was the doll, its lifeless eyes locked on mine as it came closer and closer. My back hit the wall, and the doll lunged. I screamed, throwing my hands up to block it, but the cold sting of the knife came faster than I could react. The blade pierced through my palm, tearing through flesh and bone, stopping just inches from my eye. Pain exploded through my arm as I tried to push the doll away, but its strength was unnatural, inhuman. Its porcelain face was frozen in that wicked grin, its dead, glassy eyes locked on mine, and no matter how hard I fought, the doll pushed the knife closer to my face. I gasped, the edge of the rusted blade grazing my cheek, my muscles burning as I fought to keep it from plunging into my eye. Blood dripped down my arm, and I felt my strength slipping. The doll's grip tightened, relentless, as the blade inched forward. I could see nothing but that knife, feel nothing but the cold steel pressing closer and closer. With a final, desperate surge of energy, I kicked out at the doll, my foot connecting with its stiff, fragile body. It flew backward, its small frame catching on the edge of the flames. The fire roared to life, engulfing the doll in a wave of heat and light. For a split second, the doll froze, its grin faltering as the flames spread across its porcelain body. Then, as the fire surged higher, the doll crumbled, its delicate form disintegrating as it fell onto the box. The flames twisted violently, burning in unnatural colors, swirling like a storm as the doll's body was reduced to ash, scattering into the night like dust on the wind. The fire consumed the box, the screams growing louder, more horrifying with each passing second, until they finally peaked in one last shattering cry. And then, silence. The fire died down to a smoldering pile of ashes. The air was thick with smoke. The only sound was the faint crackling of burning wood. My arm throbbed in pain, blood still dripping from my wound, but the box was gone. Destroyed. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. The damned doll and whispers were gone. It was finally over. As I drove home in the early morning light, the sun just beginning to creep over the horizon, I felt a strange emptiness settle over me. I had survived. I had destroyed the box. But I would never forget the screams, or the way that doll had moved toward me, knife in hand. I never knew what was inside the box, and I don't ever want to know. The only thing I know for sure is that whatever was inside that box was evil. And I'll spend the rest of my life hoping it's gone for good. Just call me after you listen, please.